Now we come to Unit 2. In this unit, we discuss types of experiments and validity, types of validity, and what factors affect validity. So let's start with types of experiments. Experiments are conducted in a lab setting as well as on the field. The choice of the type of experimental study depends on the purpose of the study and feasibility. Both lab experiment and field experiment have advantages and disadvantages. Let's now deal with field experiment first. Other than lab settings, experiments take place in the real life natural setting or on the field. Such experiments are called field experiments. Field experiments take place in classrooms, streets, villages, workplaces, and so forth. In a lab experiment, the researcher can exercise greater control over the experimental situation. This is not the case with field experiments. Because field experiments are conducted in natural settings, the researcher has less control over the experimental situation. The level of control results in two major differences between laboratory and field experiments as far as validity is concerned. What are the advantages of field experiments? Field experiments, as we discussed, are conducted in real life situations and therefore have higher external validity than lab experiments. It is possible to conduct a field experiment on a larger set of participants, for example, with all adult villagers. Because of their real life setting, it is easy for the participants to behave naturally in field experiments. Field experiments are useful in making observations about real life issues. For example, how people respond to real life social problems such as caste and religion. It is not possible to create a caste structure in the laboratory settings. Because of their generalizability, field experiments have greater practical application. But there are disadvantages. Due to the unpredictability of the field settings, it is not possible to control the variables as closely as in the lab experiment. Field experiments are less controlled and therefore are comparatively weaker in terms of establishing the independent variable as the only cause of the dependent variable. There is high possibility that the unknown extraneous variables influence the dependent variable. Another disadvantage is the researcher may have to face several practical problems on the field. For example, permissions from the local authorities, organizing logistics for the large set of respondents, etc. Another disadvantage is exact replication of the field experiments is difficult and therefore they are low on reliability. Lab experiments are conducted in an artificial setting of a laboratory. Artificial here means not reflecting real life. That is, the conditions in the lab do not match the conditions in the outside world. A set of individuals or subjects voluntarily participates in the experiment and is observed closely for the effect of the treatment. So what are the advantages of lab experiment? Logically, they are tighter and better controlled. They limit the impact of another independent variable on the dependent variable. They rule out alternative explanations for the effect on the dependent variable. It is possible to observe the subjects more closely and they are cost effective as compared to field experiments. Comparatively, they are easy to manipulate the independent variable in a laboratory setting. But there are disadvantages too. Lab experiments are less generalizable as compared to the field experiment. That is, they are low on external validity. Lab experiments can tell us little about how respondents will react in their real life. Due to cost and infrastructural issues, it is not possible in lab experiments to conduct a lab experiment on a larger set of participants. Participants may not behave naturally in the artificial environment of the laboratory. Now let us come to the issues of internal validity. There are two types of validity, internal and external. Internal validity. We know what validity means. In simple terms, validity means soundness of research design as well as the research instrument. In the context of experiments, we refer to two kinds of validity, internal and external. Internal validity means the independent variable alone influences the dependent variable. An experiment high on internal validity means that any observed difference in the dependent variable is directly related to the independent variable. The researcher rules out alternative explanations or the possibility of variables other than the independent variable influencing the dependent variable by controlling the experimental environment. Laboratory experiments are high on internal validity. What is external validity? External validity means the degree to which the results of the experiments are applicable or generalizable to groups and environment outside the research setting. If a study has high external validity, it means the results of the study can be generalized to the people and social situations outside the experimental situation. If a study has low external validity, it means the findings of the study cannot be generalized to the people and social situations and are applicable only to the experiment itself. Field experiments are high on external validity. As indicated, lab experiments are high on internal validity and low on external validity, whereas field experiments are high on external validity and low on internal validity. Having said this, the researcher needs to deal with the ethical issues while conducting a field experiment. Sometimes the researcher may not want to inform the subjects that they are participating in an experiment because doing so may influence their behavior. That is, the subjects may not behave naturally. Privacy is another important consideration that the researcher has to pay close attention. Issues such as privacy and confidentiality raise ethical concerns. Most institutions therefore seek institutional review board approval before they begin data collection. Now, what are the factors that affect internal and external validity? Following are some common threats to internal and external validity. The first is history effect. It basically means that an event not related to the independent variable or treatment occurs before or during the experiment and influences the dependent variable. Such unplanned events influence the outcome of the study. For example, in an experimental study designed to measure the effect of violent TV viewing on attitude, a group of subjects may have had a bad experience while traveling to the laboratory. This may influence their response to the attitude statements. Such unplanned or unanticipated events are referred to as history threat. Generally, history effects occur in experiments conducted over a longer time. The second is the maturation effect. Maturation means any change happening in the subjects due to the passage of time rather than because of the independent variable. Getting bored, sleepy, tired, hungry are some of the examples of maturation effects. These changes are other than the treatment or independent variable and they cause effect in the dependent variable and in a way influence the outcome of the study. Generally, maturation effects occur in experiments that have a long duration. For example, while conducting a study on children over many weeks or months, the children would mature with their age. This will influence their response to the treatment. The best way to control for maturation is to include a control group because maturation change would be similar in both the experimental and the control group. The third is the testing effect. Testing effect occurs when the pre-testing tool, a questionnaire for example, or the measurement process itself influences the outcome of the experiment. With the presence of the testing effect, the researcher cannot conclude that the change in the dependent variable has occurred only because of the treatment alone. For example, in the violent TV viewing and attitude study, the subjects respond to similar attitude statements on the pre-test and the post-test. The act of responding to the attitude statements in a pre-test itself can change the attitude of the subject and this gets reflected in the post-test on the study. Testing is a threat to internal validity. The Solomon 4 group design is useful in detecting the study effect in the study. Another issue is the selection bias. Selection bias occurs when subjects selected for the experimental study are assigned to groups in such a manner that they are not similar to each other with regard to the dependent variable. If both groups differ, they would respond to the treatment differently, and this would influence the outcome of the study. For example, in a study of violent TV viewing and attitude, if children from one group are sensitive to violence, they would respond to the attitude statements differently than the other group that may not be so sensitive to violence. Random assignment is the way to avoid the selection bias. Another issue is Hawthorne effect that would affect the validity. Based on an experimental study conducted years ago, Hawthorne effect refers to the reaction of the subjects of the study when they are aware that they are under observation. This affects the outcome of the study. The name Hawthorne effect comes from a series of experimental studies conducted at the Western Electric Telephone Manufacturing Factory at Hawthorne near Chicago. In these experiments, the researchers manipulated many working conditions such as lighting or time breaks and checked their impact on worker productivity. They found that the productivity of the workers increased each time when researchers changed the conditions, no matter what change was it. For example, the productivity of the workers went up even when the working conditions were made worse. This did not happen because the workers were responding to the treatment, that is change in work conditions. Instead, their productivity increased because they were aware that they were under observation. So we have come to the end of Unit 2. What did we study in Unit 2? We discussed lab experiments and field experiments. We also discussed about internal and external validity and factors that impact internal and external validity.